Picture this. You're standing in a cramped, windowless room where the stench of death mingles with incense so thick you can barely breathe. The corpse lying before you has been dead for 3 days, but nobody's in any hurry to bury it. In fact, the real horror show is just beginning. Welcome to a medieval funeral where saying goodbye to the dead was literally a matter of life and death for the living. You think modern funerals are emotionally draining? Try surviving a medieval farewell where mourners didn't just grieve, they risked plague, poison, and practices so barbaric they'd make your worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. These weren't the solemn, dignified ceremonies we know today. They were chaotic, dangerous spectacles that could easily send you to join the deceased. Before we dive into this macabre world of medieval death rituals, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to discover will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about how our ancestors honored their dead. Let's start with the most disturbing truth about medieval funerals. Nobody was entirely sure the person was actually dead. Medical knowledge was so primitive that people regularly woke up during their own funeral preparations. The fear of being buried alive was so real that wealthy families would hire watchers to sit with the corpse for days, looking for signs of life. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. These watchers weren't exactly reliable. They were usually the town drunks or desperate peasants who'd take any job for a few coins. Many were drunk, sleeping, or simply didn't care enough to notice when a corpse started moving. Archaeological evidence shows that approximately 1 in 25 medieval burials shows signs of the person trying to claw their way out of the coffin. Eleanor de Montfort, a noblewoman from the 13th century, was declared dead after a severe fever. Her family followed protocol, laying her out for the traditional 3-day vigil. On the second night, she sat up screaming. The watchers, convinced she was possessed by demons, tried to hold her down and continue with the funeral preparations. She survived, but the trauma left her mentally scarred for life. The medieval solution to this problem? They'd often break the deceased's legs or pierce their heart with a spike before burial. Better safe than sorry, they reasoned. After all, if someone woke up in their coffin, at least they wouldn't be able to escape and terrorize the living as a vengeful spirit. Now that you're sufficiently disturbed, let's talk about how medieval funerals became breeding grounds for every disease imaginable. During the Black Death, funerals didn't stop. They multiplied, and with them the death toll skyrocketed not just from the original plague, but from the funeral practices themselves. Mourners were expected to kiss the corpse's lips, hands, and feet. They'd touch the deceased's belongings, share food prepared in the same kitchen where the body was laid out, and crowd together in poorly ventilated spaces for hours. It was like hosting a disease party with a dead body as the guest of honor. Consider the funeral of Bishop Thomas de Cantilupe in 1282. Over 3,000 people attended his wake, packed into a cathedral designed for maybe 300. They'd been coming and going for 5 days, touching his body, breathing the same air, and sharing ceremonial wine from the same chalice. Within 2 weeks, over 400 attendees were dead from various contagions they'd contracted during the holy gathering. But the church insisted these practices were necessary for salvation. Touching a holy corpse was believed to cure diseases, not spread them. The irony is devastating. People literally died trying to avoid spiritual death by participating in these plague-spreading rituals. Medieval physicians, what few existed, begged authorities to limit funeral gatherings. Their warnings were ignored because religious doctrine trumped medical advice every single time. The result? Funeral-related disease outbreaks that wiped out entire communities. Here's something that will make your skin crawl. Medieval corpse preparation was basically medieval torture applied to dead bodies. The process was so brutal that even seasoned undertakers would vomit during the procedure. First, they'd stuff every orifice of the body with herbs, spices, and cloth to prevent fluids from leaking. This sounds reasonable until you realize they were doing this with dirty hands, contaminated materials, and absolutely no understanding of sanitation. The stuffing process often involved breaking bones and dislocating joints to make the body fit into elaborate poses. Then came the real horror show, the embalming process for wealthy families. They'd cut open the corpse and manually remove all the organs, often while family members watched and participated. Children as young as 8 were expected to help with this grisly task as part of their education about death and family duty. The organs weren't disposed of sanitarily. They were often boiled into a soup that mourners were expected to consume, as part of the funeral feast. Yes, you read that correctly. Medieval funeral dinners frequently included a stew made from the deceased's internal organs, believed to transfer the dead person's strength and wisdom to the living. Lady Margaret Beaufort's funeral preparation in 1509 was documented in detail by her horrified chaplain. The process took 6 days, during which her body was repeatedly cut open, sewn shut, cut open again and manipulated into different positions. The smell was so overwhelming that several preparation assistants collapsed and had to be carried away. Yet family members were required to stay present for the entire process as a sign of respect. Medieval funeral fashion wasn't just about looking appropriately somber. It was literally designed to kill you slowly. Mourning clothes were dyed with toxic substances that caused skin irritation, respiratory problems, and in some cases, death by poisoning. Black funeral dyes were particularly lethal because they required massive amounts of lead, mercury, and arsenic to achieve the deep, lasting color that symbolized grief. Wealthy mourners would wear these toxic garments for months during official mourning periods, slowly poisoning themselves as a demonstration of their devotion to the deceased. But poor people had it worse. They couldn't afford new mourning clothes, so they'd rent or borrow funeral attire that had been worn by dozens of previous mourners. These garments were never properly cleaned between uses, becoming repositories for every disease that had attended previous funerals. Wearing someone else's mourning clothes was essentially playing Russian roulette with medieval plagues. The funeral of King Edward III in 1307 provides a perfect example of this deadly fashion show. Court records show that over 60 mourners died within 3 months of the funeral, most from mysterious illnesses that physicians couldn't identify. Modern analysis suggests they were poisoned by the toxic dyes in their elaborate mourning costumes, which they wore continuously for the required 100-day mourning period. Women had an additional challenge. They were expected to cover their entire bodies and faces with heavy veils and wrappings that restricted breathing and movement. Many women literally suffocated during long funeral ceremonies, collapsing from lack of oxygen while trying to maintain the proper posture of grief. If you thought the organ soup was bad, wait until you hear about the full medieval funeral feast. These weren't gentle gatherings to comfort the grieving. They were week-long bacchanalias that combined excessive drinking, gluttony, and rituals that would horrify modern sensibilities. The centerpiece of many noble funeral feasts was a dish called funeral pie, a massive pastry filled with whatever animals could be caught around the deceased's property. This included rats, dogs, cats, and birds that had been feeding on decomposing matter around the graveyard. The logic was that these animals had absorbed the essence of the dead, making them sacred food that would honor the deceased. But here's the truly sickening part. The preparation of funeral food often took place in the same room where the corpse was laid out. Cooks would prepare elaborate meals while the dead body decomposed just feet away, with flies moving freely between the corpse and the cooking surfaces. Food poisoning at medieval funerals was so common that people planned for it by bringing their own physicians. The funeral feast for Duke William of Normandy in 1087 lasted 9 days and killed more people than the battle that originally wounded him. Over 200 guests died from food poisoning, alcohol poisoning, or violence that broke out during the drunken revelries. The feast had become more dangerous than the war that preceded it. Musicians and entertainers were hired to perform during these feasts, but their acts were specifically designed to be macabre and disturbing. Jesters would mock the deceased, dancers would perform with skulls and bones, and musicians would play songs about death and decomposition while people tried to eat. The entertainment was deliberately designed to be as psychologically traumatic as possible. Here's the final horror that will make you grateful for modern cemetery security. Medieval burial sites were essentially open-season hunting grounds for thieves, body snatchers, and worse. The funeral ceremony itself was often just the beginning of the deceased's posthumous torment. Professional grave robbers worked in organized gangs, following funeral processions to identify wealthy burial sites. They'd wait exactly 3 days, long enough for the mourners to leave, short enough that the jewelry and clothing hadn't completely decomposed. These weren't just opportunistic thieves. They were skilled craftsmen who could strip a corpse clean and disappear before dawn. But the grave robbers were the least of a dead person's worries. Medieval medical schools desperately needed bodies for dissection and anatomical study. They'd pay premium prices for fresh corpses, no questions asked. This created a thriving black market in human bodies, with some funeral directors secretly selling corpses to medical schools before the burial and filling the coffins with rocks or animal carcasses. The most disturbing aspect of this medieval body trade was the involvement of church officials. Many priests and bishops were secretly partners in grave robbing operations, using their knowledge of burial schedules and locations to help thieves target the most valuable graves. They justified this by claiming the money helped fund church operations, but in reality, they were profiting from the desecration of the very people they'd pretended to honor. Thomas Cromwell's investigation into church corruption in the 1530s uncovered a network of over 40 churches actively involved in selling corpses to medical schools. One Yorkshire church had sold over 300 bodies in a single year, replacing them with dressed-up pig carcasses for the burial ceremonies. Medieval people didn't just fear disease and grave robbers, they were absolutely terrified that the dead would return to take revenge on the living. This wasn't abstract superstition, it was practical concern that shaped every aspect of funeral planning and execution. Every medieval funeral included elaborate rituals designed to prevent the deceased from becoming a vengeful spirit. Mourners would perform specific chants, burn protective herbs, and carry iron objects to ward off supernatural attacks. But these protective measures were dangerous in themselves, often involving toxic smoke inhalation and the risk of fires in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces. The most terrifying aspect of medieval funeral superstition was the belief that the dead could possess the living during funeral ceremonies. Mourners would suddenly begin speaking in the voice of the deceased, claiming to have messages from beyond the grave. While modern psychology might explain this as grief-induced hallucination, medieval communities treated these incidents as genuine supernatural encounters. These possessions often turned violent, with the possessed person attacking other mourners or trying to dig up the grave with their bare hands. Church records from the 14th century describe dozens of funerals that ended in mass hysteria, with multiple mourners becoming possessed simultaneously and requiring physical restraint to prevent them from harming themselves or others. The funeral of Lady Catherine de Valois in 1437 is particularly well documented. 3 different mourners claimed to be possessed by her spirit during the ceremony, each giving different and contradictory messages from the afterlife. The confusion and terror that followed led to a riot that destroyed the church and killed 11 people. The original funeral was forgotten in the chaos of the supernatural panic it had generated. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of medieval funerals was how they traumatized and killed the children forced to participate. Medieval society had no concept of protecting children from the psychological and physical horrors of death rituals. Kids as young as 4 were expected to participate fully in every aspect of the funeral process. Children were required to help prepare the corpse, touch the dead body for blessings, and stay awake during multi-day vigils. They'd be forced to drink the organ soup, wear the toxic mourning clothes, and witness the most disturbing aspects of medieval death culture. Many children developed severe psychological trauma that lasted their entire lives, assuming they survived the experience at all. The mortality rate for children attending medieval funerals was staggering. They were more susceptible to diseases spread during funeral gatherings, more likely to be trampled in crowd panics, and less able to survive the physical demands of extended mourning rituals. Some historians estimate that 10% of children who attended major medieval funerals died within a month of the ceremony. Young Margaret Plantagenet, forced to attend her father's funeral at age 6, was documented by court physicians as suffering from what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD. She stopped speaking for over a year, refused to eat solid food, and would scream uncontrollably whenever she saw anything black. Her psychological damage was so severe that she was eventually declared unfit for marriage and spent her life in religious seclusion. The practice of forcing children to kiss corpses was particularly deadly. Children's developing immune systems couldn't handle the massive bacterial load, leading to widespread childhood deaths following major funerals. Yet this practice continued because it was believed that children who didn't properly honor the dead would be cursed with short lives. A tragically ironic belief, given how many children died from following this very custom. Here's a financial horror story that medieval families knew all too well. A proper funeral could bankrupt multiple generations. The social pressure to honor the dead with elaborate ceremonies meant that families often spent themselves into poverty just to avoid social disgrace. A typical noble funeral cost the equivalent of 3 years' income for the deceased's family. This included payments for the church ceremony, funeral feast, mourning clothes for all family members, professional mourners, musicians, and elaborate tomb construction. Families would mortgage their land, sell their livestock, and even put their children into indentured servitude to pay for funeral expenses. But refusing to pay for a proper funeral had devastating social consequences. Families who couldn't afford elaborate death rituals were shunned by their communities, excluded from business opportunities, and sometimes even accused of causing the death through neglect or witchcraft. It was financial extortion, disguised as religious obligation. The funeral industry in medieval times was incredibly corrupt, with undertakers, priests, and suppliers forming cartels that fixed prices and eliminated competition. Grieving families were charged outrageous fees for basic services, knowing that they had no choice but to pay. Some unscrupulous funeral providers would even threaten to curse the deceased's soul if the family couldn't pay their bills. Records from medieval London show that over 30% of families who held elaborate funerals were forced into bankruptcy within 5 years. Many lost their homes, their businesses, and their social standing simply because they tried to honor their dead according to societal expectations. The funeral industry was literally feeding off the financial corpses of grieving families. Now, before you start thinking that every single medieval funeral was this chamber of horrors I've described, let me give you some historical perspective. Not every funeral involved organ soup and grave robbing. Simple peasant funerals were often just quick burials with minimal ceremony, and some religious communities developed more sanitary practices over time. But here's the crucial point. The elaborate, dangerous funeral practices I've described weren't exceptions. They were the aspirational norm. Every family that could afford it participated in these deadly rituals because they believed their eternal salvation depended on it. The fact that simpler funerals existed doesn't diminish the horror of what the majority of medieval people considered proper death honor. Even the safer peasant funerals had their own dangers. Mass graves during plague years, burials in contaminated ground, and the complete absence of any medical oversight meant that even simple funerals could trigger disease outbreaks that wiped out entire villages. The medieval obsession with elaborate death rituals stemmed from a terrifying combination of religious fanaticism, medical ignorance, and social pressure that created a perfect storm of funeral-related mortality. They weren't just burying their dead, they were often burying themselves in the process. Those who did survive medieval funerals didn't escape unscathed. The psychological trauma of witnessing such brutal death rituals, combined with the physical effects of toxic exposure and disease, left lasting damage on entire communities. Medieval physicians noted that funeral sickness was a recognized condition affecting mourners who survived the initial ceremony, but suffered from mysterious illnesses for months afterward. Modern analysis suggests these were likely combinations of PTSD, heavy metal poisoning from funeral dyes, and chronic infections contracted during the funeral gatherings. Many medieval people developed what we'd now call thanatophobia, an overwhelming fear of death that paradoxically made them more vulnerable to the very funeral practices they feared. They'd participate in increasingly elaborate and dangerous death rituals, trying to ensure their own proper burial while simultaneously traumatizing themselves with each funeral they attended. The cycle was vicious and self-perpetuating. Each generation passed down increasingly elaborate and dangerous funeral traditions, convinced that their ancestors' suffering had been necessary for salvation. The trauma of medieval funerals literally shaped the psychological landscape of entire societies for centuries. So there you have it, the horrifying reality of medieval funerals, where saying goodbye to the dead was often a death sentence for the living. These weren't the dignified, peaceful ceremonies we associate with honoring our departed loved ones. They were dangerous, traumatic spectacles that combined every possible threat to human health and sanity into one mandatory social obligation. The next time you attend a modern funeral and feel emotional or uncomfortable, remember Margaret Plantagenet, Eleanor de Montfort, and the millions of medieval people who risked everything just to say goodbye to their loved ones. Remember that the simple act of mourning safely without fear of disease, poisoning, or supernatural terror is a privilege that took centuries to achieve. Our ancestors didn't choose these brutal funeral practices because they were cruel or ignorant. They were trapped in a system that combined religious terror, medical ignorance, and social pressure into a perfect storm of death-related trauma. They did the best they could with the knowledge they had, but their best was often a nightmare that would haunt entire communities for generations. The medieval funeral was humanity's attempt to honor the dead while desperately trying to protect the living from death's mysteries. Instead, they created rituals that often sent more people to their graves than the original deaths they were trying to honor. It's a sobering reminder that good intentions, without knowledge and wisdom, can create horrors beyond imagination. If these medieval truths have shocked you as much as they shocked me when I first discovered them, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. There are so many more dark secrets from our past waiting to be revealed, and I promise each one will make you grateful to be living in the modern world. Until next time, maybe give your local funeral director a thank you note. They're providing a service that your medieval ancestors could only dream of.